Talk out there. We hope to cut through some of the fog so that we can see a bit more clearly. My name is Ken Yi, and I am the moderator. I am the secretary of the New England chapter of the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, which is the sponsor of tonight's program. The other co-sponsors are CodePink and Mass Peace Action, or MAPA. We're very fortunate to have 4 very knowledgeable speakers whom I will introduce shortly. But just in terms of the format for tonight's program, each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. We plan to have a few questions. Please put your question in the chat box where we will select our questions. We will not have time for spoken questions. So put your questions in the chat box. We will look through those. Tonight's program is live streamed on YouTube and will be recorded. The spotlight will be on the speakers, so generally audience faces will not be seen. However, please feel free to turn off your video if you prefer. And now our first speaker is Marcus Breen. Marcus worked as a journalist and consultant in Australia before moving to the US in 1996 to work as an academic. He has been teaching in the communication department at Boston College since 2014. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to the organisers and to the participants and to everyone who's watching and will watch. These comments that I'm going to make stem from research about the proposed Trump TikTok bans, and it's from this article that appeared in an online journal called Fast Capitalism about a year ago, and anybody who's interested in reading that article is welcome to it and welcome to just access Fast Capitalism. It is eminently valuable resource for many people, certainly many of us in communication, but other fields of criticism. The key point to start with about the TikTok bans, as they've been called, is to see them from a geopolitical perspective. And this geopolitical perspective, as I'm sure we all appreciate, is about a struggle by the United States for global hegemony, or in more common, more plain English, global domination. And this has taken form in the document called US Grand Strategy, which are variously available and quite easily and readily available on the internet. And I've looked at a number of them and read a number of them. And there are also, it's worth keeping in mind, enormous resources that are made available to the government, and indeed which draw attention to the questions of grand strategy. So can you see this? Oops.
Not yet.
Not yet.
I think Marcus left the meeting. He may come right back. He probably clicked the wrong button or something.
Technology, what are you going to say, right? Well, our technical guru Code, should we go to our second speaker until he comes back, or do you think we should just wait?
Depends if it will make sense out of order, but he probably will come back in a minute or two.
Okay.
If you want to get started with another speaker, that's fine too. Oh, here he comes.
Oh, here he comes. Are you emitting it? Okay.
Yeah.
My apologies. I think I inadvertently deleted myself. So this is what I wanted to share earlier. This is the article that I mentioned, which you'd be more than welcome to look at in Fast Capitalism. The other point that I wanted to make, or that I was making, is that there is an enormous number of resources directed at the efforts by the United States government to develop the grand strategy, and which feeds into the efforts to put an end, if you like, to TikTok in this country. And one of these important resources is this one, which is, of course, available again to everybody, but which, oh, sorry, I'm having such trouble here, is, of course, from the RAND National Security Research Division, and you can get an idea of the dedicated commitment that's made on the basis of outsourced research by the organisations such as this, of which there are many. And we pale in significance as a peace movement, and as, if you like, for those people who are in the Friends of China group, as Friends of China, we pale in significance compared to the amount of resources that are made available to very, very many people within the US government administration, but also have a deep influence on public opinion. The key concept that emerged out of the TikTok program, or the banning proposals, was, of course, what's called the US containment strategy. And TikTok was really just a tactic within one of many within that US containment strategy. And so while this was proposed from the very early days of the Trump administration, and then most profoundly from 2018 on, Mr. Biden, or President Biden, continued to attempt to ban not only TikTok, but rolled it into a number of proposals to remove Chinese manufactured electronic devices because, and this is the important point here, because the pretext was that they were a threat to national security. And so TikTok became caught up, if you like, in this very highly emotional target of a problem for national security, for the United States government, for the people, and for technology in general. It was also then folded into a larger, more challenging tradition of anti-communism within the United States. And these two things often went hand in hand. And any focus on TikTok tends to show the emergence of an anti-China, anti-other, anti-communist approach that really makes it impossible to recognize that a technology platform such as TikTok is an independent, privately run organization. So the anti-China, anti-communism, national security approach really defined TikTok, but I think there's a more recent development, and that is that the proposals to suppress TikTok are part of a larger strategy within this containment approach, and that is to demean and dehumanize China, and to make, if you like, the impression, and then create the impression as a taken for granted aspect of public opinion, that only by recognizing China as the enemy can we actually make any sense of them, so that we already start with a negative view of China. And then, of course, communication is used over and over and over again to establish a negative portrayal of China through TikTok. So this is often an underrepresented aspect of the TikTok arguments, but of course it's become much more apparent in the last year or so that the speech against TikTok has at another level been rolled into the escalation of warlike speech against China, again to make the point, by dehumanizing the other, that is China and its electronic and communication industry. And it's very unfortunate for those of us in the peace movement that the US appears to be planning for a war against China. And of course, some of these points, those of you who are familiar with the work of Noam Chomsky over the years will be familiar with also the points that he made about manufacturing consent being the key objective of the US media within what he considered the propaganda model. It's worth just repeating some basic principles here that we often overlook, and that is the importance, indeed the centrality of communication to understanding ourselves and our place in the world. And again, I would say that TikTok provides an example of how an independent private company can provide a communication resource that does not meet the, if you like, the standards or the criteria for what happens within the national borders of the United States, where there is a clear set of communication priorities. And this became apparent when there were complaints about what people were saying, particularly young people were saying in support of Palestine. And so it became another element of the debate about TikTok, which is that it was not an American company. It could not be managed and controlled in the way that other platforms had been controlled. And by other platforms, of course, I mean the globally dominant ones, with the exception of TikTok, Google, Facebook, Meta, Microsoft, X, Twitter, all US platforms, all deeply embedded within US capitalist, commercial, consumerist culture and reproducing that culture. TikTok, of course, does the same thing. So it's not as if it's some sort of wonderful utopianistic, non-capitalist, non-consumerist thing or platform. It is part of the same, if you like, ecosystem.
Marcus, if sorry to interrupt you, if you can finish up.
Right, sure.
Thank you.
Karen is going to make some points about the US platforms and surveillance of platforms, so I'm not going to comment on surveillance. But I do want to point to the fact that there has been tremendous success by TikTok, if you like, and by it in the last little while. And I'll just quickly share this image here to illustrate just how dramatic the growth has been from 2020 to here we are now. And not only the number of the revenues, but the number of users going up to, as you can see here, the number of users consistently rising, causing a great deal of consternation amongst not only the political elites in the United States, but also those people who own social media platforms. And finally, of course, one last point is that there is a significant concern about age demographics, and I'll finish on this, I promise. And that is, if you look here, this is a problem where much of the argument is made that young people especially are active users of TikTok. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And by the way, we will post a lot information afterwards in emails to the audience. Thank you so much, Marcus. Our second speaker is Karen Gullo. Karen is an award-winning former journalist with Associated Press and Bloomberg News. She is senior writer at Electronic Frontier Foundation, the leading nonprofit organization defending civil rights in a digital world. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about the TikTok ban and free speech. Freedom of speech and association includes our rights to choose the kind of communication technology or platform that we'd like to use. And politicians should not be able to tell us what to say or where we can say it or who we can say it to. But that's what's happening with the TikTok law. Millions of Americans, as you saw on the graph just now, use TikTok every day to share and receive ideas, information, opinions, videos, and the platform hosts enormous national and international communities that most US users can't readily reach elsewhere. And it also plays an important role for minority communities that are seeking to, foster solidarity and highlight issues that are important to them. So the use of TikTok to access and communicate information is squarely within the protections of the First Amendment. But the TikTok law is a sweeping ban on free expression. It restricts protected speech and association, and it deliberately singles out one particular medium for a blanket prohibition. The justifications for this law are concerns over national security, that because it's owned by a Chinese company, TikTok user data is at risk of falling into the hands of the Chinese government, among other concerns. We don't know what information the government has to back up these claims that TikTok is a national security risk. The government has said that TikTok poses a potential cybersecurity risk and could potentially, collect Americans' data. But so far, we haven't seen sufficient evidence that the ban is constitutional. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is, as was mentioned earlier, nearly all social media platforms, mobile apps, other online businesses collect a lot of personal information about their users. And, there's really important data privacy concerns about all of these platforms collecting this data, including but not limited to TikTok. All these platforms and apps, they harvest your personal information and they package it up and they sell it to the highest bidder. And that can include, they sell it to insurance companies, data brokers, police departments. Thieves get a hold of it, and the US government can access it through subpoenas. So, this mass collection of personal data by platforms should concern everybody. It's being used in ways that really put at risk our privacy and other civil liberties. If you just check out the lead story this week on the 404 Media website, it's about a tool purchased by the government that can show the movements of a cell phone. And of course, a cell phone is connected to a person, and it can show where they went, when they went there, how long they stayed there. So it can really paint a very intimate and detailed picture of what someone is doing all day long in their private life. TikTok may raise special concerns given the surveillance and censorship practices of China for some users. Pervasive online surveillance is a fact of life within China. The government collects extensive biometric data on its residents, and including in Xinjiang, for example. And so there are people who may have specific concerns about the possibility of China having access to their data, and who may choose not to use TikTok, and people like journalists who have sources in China, student protesters in Hong Kong, members of the Uyghur community, and so on. There's also people that choose not to use Facebook or Instagram because they simply do not like the prospect of Meta having, all of their information or a lot of their data, and can use it to train their AI models without their consent. So choosing to avoid TikTok and Facebook and other platforms is our right, and it's a choice. But having the government choose for you which platform you can access does not comport with democracy. And, there's Montana as a state tried to, ban TikTok through a law, and a federal court in that case actually got it right and ruled that the law violated users' First Amendment rights to speak and to access information online. Another justification for the ban is that it can be used to spread misinformation. A House committee report that accompanied the bill that eventually became the act said that the threat to national security is not only that TikTok and apps like it can be used by foreign nations to collect information on Americans, but also because they could be used to spread disinformation and propaganda on the American public. But think about it. We hear every day about how foreign governments are inundating the news feeds of every social media platform with election misinformation, AI generated videos full of bogus conspiracy theories and what have you. Here are headlines from just the last day. The Guardian: Russia behind viral misinformation against Tim Walz, U.S. officials say. Wired: Microsoft warns foreign disinformation is hitting the U.S. election from all sides. And AP, citing the same Microsoft report, efforts by Iran, Russia, and China to sway U.S. voters may escalate. So misinformation is not something that we can pin exclusively to TikTok as a speech platform. But Congress's content-based justifications for the ban make it clear that the government is targeting TikTok because it finds speech that Americans receive from it to be harmful. But that's not really good enough. Simply invoking national security without clearly demonstrating a threat doesn't make the ban constitutional. I'm not a lawyer, but I do know from reading the briefs that EFF has filed in the case challenging the federal ban that whenever the government seeks to restrict or limit free speech rights, those rights are so fundamental that the government has to overcome a very high bar and strictly scrutinize the justifications for restricting speech, even where national security risks are alleged. But the bottom line is that user data will still be collected by numerous platforms, and even possibly by TikTok if it changes, ownership. And it will still be sold to data brokers who can sell it elsewhere, just as they do now. And if China wanted to buy this information, it could probably find a way to do it. Banning TikTok from operating here probably won't stop China from acquiring the data, people's data, because it's out there, and it's out there for, the government to purchase, as I said, law enforcement to purchase. And that's where the concern should be. The better approach is to limit how all businesses here, collect personal data. This would reduce the supply of data that any adversary, might obtain. And we don't need bans on protected speech. The best solution is not to single out, one business or country for a ban. Rather, we should enact comprehensive consumer data privacy legislation that allows us to opt out of data collection and hold, platforms responsible when they violate that kind of a rule. It should give us the ability to say, no, I don't want my information shared or kept or stored. So reducing, the massive storage of personal data collected by all businesses, TikTok included, we could reduce opportunities for all governments, including China, to buy or steal this data. And we should be calling on Congress to pass that kind of legislation. And just to wrap up, just know that Congress is considering many other bad laws against access to information in the form of like speech or expression found online or in books. And these laws are based on perceived harms that really are not in evidence. The Kids Online Safety Act, for instance, COSA it's called, is one of those laws. It would give the FTC and possibly state attorney generals the power to restrict protected online speech that they find objectionable. The law's features, which I urge you to read up on, will stifle online speech and lead platforms to censor protected speech. In addition, many states are passing or have passed age verification laws. These are laws that target access to adult content, or they limit access to platforms by minors by requiring them to verify their age. And there's a lot of things wrong with these laws, not the least of which is that they are like data collection machines. They don't come with protections about where your personal data goes or whether it can be sold or stored forever. They will block, access to information to young people and other people. And really, no one should have to hand their driver's license over just to access free websites. And that's why EFF opposes mandated age verification laws, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. But like the TikTok—
excuse me, Karen, if you could finish up Thank you.
I'm right at the end. These laws are attempts to block access to information and ban free speech and expression. And they are part of a really disturbing narrative that access to free and open information is somehow harmful. And we need to protect people from certain kinds of information and let politicians decide which information platforms that we can access. And that's not okay. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Karen, for offering alternatives to banning TikTok. Before I introduce our third speaker, I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions at the end, please put it in the chat. We're not going to have time for live questions. Our third speaker is Megan Russell. Megan is the coordinator of CodePink's China is Not Our Enemy campaign. She's a graduate of the London School of Economics. She has lived in Shanghai and speaks Mandarin. Welcome.
Thank you, Ken. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan, and I am the China campaign coordinator at CodePink. So the campaign that we're running currently is called China is Not Our Enemy, and the name was created in direct response to the narratives running through the media and through our congressional halls that China is our enemy, that China is something to fear, that China is evil, that China is trying to take over the world and destroy the US and everything it stands for, which are all false, very false narratives that require some clarity, I think. So I'm going to give you just a very brief background on what I call the forged China threat and how this relates to what is currently happening with TikTok. So the US and China actually enjoyed a relatively good relationship until around the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, which occurred at a time when China was undergoing rapid economic expansion and a growing influence globally, as well as having extreme internal success under their system and policies that sort of fall under the umbrella of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And by internal success, I mean, the complete eradication of extreme poverty, economic infrastructural development, increased social stability, improved living standards, increased average life expectancy, and so on. So what changed? Why the shift to this US-China perspective? Was it that the US suddenly found out that China is the enemy of the West? No, it was that China was successful, and this success was threatening to shift the power balance of the world, shifting us from years of US global hegemony to a multipolar system. So the US likes to consider itself the hero or the protector of the world, the pioneer of human rights and democratic freedom, and it uses this narrative to justify a lot of the horrific things it's done over the years, which is quite evident, especially this past year, as we watch a US-supported genocide unfold in front of our eyes, that the true motivation is power and greed, and that human rights are only supported, when they fall in line with US interests. But my point is that China's growing influence was in opposition to US interests, which is why we saw this sudden switch to anti-China messaging and the use of tension points like Taiwan and the South China Sea to justify the hyper-militarization of the Asia Pacific. And surrounding China with military bases and thousands of troops. And a very interesting statistic I might point out is that the US has over 800 foreign military bases around the world, and China has just one in East Africa, and none in the entire Western Hemisphere. As well as the fact that in the past 40 or so years, China's not invaded a single country, whereas US has invaded countless. And I think, it's clear just from that, if we're comparing which is the true empire. I will also note that the success of China, very importantly, was also triggering to this idea of Western exceptionalism, that any form of socialism could actually improve the lives of people, could actually obtain any measure of success. And this exceptionalism is based on ideals, on the imagined perfection of free markets and democracy, but also on colonial racist doctrines. And that's really at the root of a lot of this negativity as well. Unfortunately, though, it's often disguised or dressed up like something else. It's at the root of it a dehumanization of China and of Chinese people, that they are worth less, that they aren't deserving of jobs or opportunities or success. And this manifests itself easily into a global system that is inherently based on this, division of humanity that we have been forced to accept as normal. And that doesn't just go for China, of course, but the entire global South, right? And China actually defines itself as a member of the global South because of its shared experience with Western imperialism and the very real battle to shirk off the negative influences of Western expansionism and find its footing in the world after years of foreign intervention. And it's been one of the most successful cases, being the only country to go from low to high on the UN Human Development Index since the program was created, entirely skipping the middle. So China's rise was a threat to US interests. And how does the US respond to threats? Well, historically, it has had a real over-reliance on militarization and interventionism, operating on a real anachronistic Cold War mentality. And generally, in order to pursue these paths, our government will try to manufacture consent, as Marcus mentioned, for militarization, for war, because it's far easier with public support and helps to maintain internal stability as well. And this is why you've seen the steady rise of anti-China propaganda and fear-mongering. In fact, the House just last month passed a bill funding $1.6 billion to anti-China propaganda around the world. That is $1.6 billion going to information warfare, because in order to pursue this agenda, we need to convince the rest of the world that China is a threat, and many aren't convinced. So there was a very brief summary on the motivation and the creation of the China threat from more of a political standpoint. So, where does TikTok come into play? Well, for one, it's another attempt to contain China and to heighten fears around China. There is this running narrative of Chinese people being sneaky and deceitful and spying on everything you do, which, first of all, has some serious dissonance when it comes to the US government's privacy invasion of its own citizens. And it's also blatantly racist. TikTok has been singled out from other apps because it is owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance. And data privacy is a concern on all apps, right? Or it should be, but for TikTok, especially because it's owned by a Chinese company and because it's also a very successful app and used by over 150 million Americans, it's been singled out. So our government cites TikTok as a security concern, just as it cites China's monopoly on solar panels as a security concern. So forget climate change, which is the biggest security concern of all. Anything China owns or has influence over is of greater concern to our government. And there are also many economic motivations as well, which really goes hand in hand with this battle for the US to maintain economic and political influence over the world by stifling China's growth, as well as, like I mentioned, the underlying idea that China is not deserving of its success. But Ting will go a lot more into the economic factors. I want to talk a little bit more about other similar legislation. So just last month, Congress ushered in what they called China Week, where they passed 25 anti-China bills, including the propaganda bill I mentioned, all with this end goal of, quote, countering the influence of the Communist Party of China. And the week was essentially like this last-ditch effort to, garner political support by being tough on China. And the bills were all very inflammatory and hateful and really not all that smart. One bill is set to revive the China Initiative under the Justice Department that President Trump helped create, but was disbanded initially under Biden. And the China Initiative targets people working at, academic and research institutions for being spies for China. And one of the reasons it was originally abandoned was that it was clearly xenophobic and led to a lot of workplace discrimination and needlessly ruined the careers and lives of many Chinese Americans. And for one scientist, Jane Wu, who lost her lab after being put under investigation, it cost her life. So it's a really horrible program they are actively trying to revive. And unfortunately, in the likely case of a Republican Senate majority or a Trump win, that could very easily happen, and will probably happen anyway, to be honest. So these bills, like the TikTok ban, perpetuate Asian American hate, which we see on the news every week. There was just an attack a couple days ago here in DC on a Chinese American woman downtown, and the AAPI community here in the US has really been feeling the xenophobia coming from our government's anti-China rhetoric, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. So not only is the TikTok ban against free speech, it's also dangerous. It's institutionalized encouragement of hate crime. And we saw the same thing with the demonization of Muslim Americans during the US war on terror and the manufacturing of consent for war in the Middle East. We saw this in the 1950s with the Red Scare style McCarthyism. It's the same thing. And when you attend the hearings and listen to what our Congress people are saying, it's really evident how much they are guided by paranoia and hatred. Like they blindly call the TikTok CEO Shou Chu a Chinese spy, even though he's Singaporean, and there's absolutely no evidence. It's disgusting, and they don't even pronounce his name right. There's also the additional layer, which I think is important to mention, that TikTok is used by many people to discuss really contentious topics. It's become a platform for all kinds of activists and independent news sources to talk about really every issue under the sun. And there's a huge and growing platform for anti-war activists, anti-imperialists that are blatantly critical of the US and its foreign policy. For CodePink, you know, social media is a huge tool for us. It's one of our main sources of connecting and building movements, of spreading our message, growing as an organization and gaining a following and support through volunteerism and through donations. And TikTok has been a really helpful tool for growth. And when you ban a platform like that, you're also actively silencing so many voices. You're hurting organizations and small businesses that rely on the exposure that TikTok gives them. You're limiting access to educational materials, different opinions, and different ways of thinking that could potentially change how, you know, one envisions the world. I mean,
Excuse me, Megan, if you can make your final point. Thank you.
sure. Yeah, so TikTok is more than just social media, you know, it's a tool for change. And this anti-China rhetoric, you know, it's important to point out that, you know, data protection, national security is being weaponized against China, against Chinese Americans, anything with links to China. And this is only leading to an acceleration of the new Cold War with China and an increase in Asian American hate in the US. And this is really dangerous right now, not just for the safety of Asian Americans, but because of this blind march towards conflict escalation with China. And right now there are threats that far outweigh the economic and political rivalry. You know, we see that in destruction of entire towns being washed away by extreme weather and global wildfires and mass displacement. So we're at a time where we really need cooperation above all else, and senseless counterproductive policies like the TikTok ban are unfortunately instead the focus of our Congress.
Thank you so much, Megan. Our fourth speaker is Ting Huang. Ting is the Communications Director of Massachusetts Peace Action, MAPA, which is an anti-war organization. She will speak on how the TikTok ban is ultimately a form of economic war waged on China by the US to maintain global hegemony. Thank you, Ting.
Thanks, Ken. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm Ting. I'm the Communications Director at Massachusetts Peace Action. My co-panelists have, you know, given a really great overview of the subject so far and put things very eloquently. So I might not be saying all the points are covered, but hopefully I'll be able to hone in on some parts and, you know, contextualize certain things as well. Massachusetts Peace Action is a really broad tent, but we take quite like an anti-intervention and anti-imperialist stance on foreign policy. And we use social media, which, you know, I manage as communications director, to do a lot of like public education and like information sharing on our issues. One of those is obviously TikTok, and just quickly follow at Mass Peace Action on TikTok. But moving on, so TikTok is really it's as Marcus and Megan have already talked about, a lot of the users are very young. It's a very dynamic app. It's a very it capitalizes on our short attention spans. It's an effective way of sharing information. There's like a niche for everyone. So like there's lots of different ways to kind of communicate and like express and like, you know, distribute information, I guess. And about 40% of TikTok users are under the age of 24, and most users, so over 70%, are under the age of 34. So it's no surprise that it's a popular way for younger activists who tend to be more progressive to find information and learn and also share information with each other. So Megan has already mentioned a lot of the Cold War stuff. There's also propaganda and like kind of yellow peril narratives that are being leveraged to justify the banning of TikTok. And I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, like the economic side of things, and also related to that, contextualize it, like I guess a little bit broadly in regards to, I guess, like global politics and like what Megan and Marcus have already touched on. So this is ultimately an economic war. It's about US corporate interests. It's about capitalism, and we can't really separate the US from US corporate interests and US corporations. So it is like I feel like the term economic kind of makes it sound a bit more like narrow, but economics is how the world is run. It's how the US maintains its hegemony and has dominance because of its dominance over markets. So first of all, TikTok is not based in China. It's based in LA and Singapore. And its parent company is ByteDance, which is a Chinese company. And last year, the Biden administration gave TikTok an ultimatum that China needs to either sell its ownership to a US company or they're going to ban the app, which is quite ironic when you consider how this goes against the values of free market competition and things that we're supposed to associate with the US, and not with in contrast, the authoritarian China. And if we look at the slew of other bills being passed, it's not just about TikTok or like national security or foreign interference. It includes tariffs and sanctions on Chinese tech at large, Chinese electric vehicles, solar panels, phones. Again, as Megan has already said, it is about stemming China's growth. And there is a very telling Forbes article, and I'm going to link it quickly here in the chat in case anyone wants to have a look at it later. But you can pretty much gauge. Sorry, give me 1 second. You can pretty much gauge what it's about just from looking at the headline, which is banning TikTok would cause like the stocks of Alphabet, which is Google, and Meta and Snapchat to jump like astronomically. So it's like a $400-something billion $1 billion to basically be gained from the banning of TikTok. So I feel like this kind of encapsulates how much of this is really like economic driven. And maintaining the US hegemony is, does actually prevent other countries from prospering or, developing. So I wanted to contextualize this within as well, like the broader, I guess, like geopolitical and like imperialism, like war framework, because TikTok is about China, insofar as China is the country currently with the that's closest to having enough economic power and productive capacity to actually genuinely challenge US hegemony, i.e. what the US calls like the rules-based order, and also challenge its dominance over global capital. So like it's important to kind of know that this isn't an economic war between two countries on like equal footing, because it is something that is enacted on like more of the world than just China, even though China does have a lot of people. And this is like a position that is bipartisan. Even though a lot of the talking points about China are a bit more conservative leaning, and so they're associated with the Republican Party, it's a position held by both parties. This is about protecting US tech company monopolies, and it also is about making countries around the world dependent on US technology and therefore continuing to funnel wealth into the US. I mean, an example is India. It's a good example. So the Modi government is very pro-US. It's part of the Quad, which is like a military political alliance. And in 2020, India banned 59 major Chinese apps, which includes TikTok. And the result, as predicted, was that it solidified control of US big tech companies and their monopolies over India, which is the most populous country on earth and has almost a fifth of the world's population. And if you look at the top, social media that people in India use, they're all US companies, and the US is aware of this because India doesn't have, serious alternatives to US tech companies like otherwise. So it's not about, stimulating the local development of like tech development or anything like that. It's about being dependent on US companies and US technologies. And also in that vein, so it affects India, and it also is kind of like extrapolated beyond that. One of the bills that were passed was called Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. I think one of the other panelists have already mentioned this, but it gives the US license basically to sanction people, including US citizens who work with Chinese companies or are like vaguely associated with an entity that's like under the influence of China or whatever. And it lumps China in together with a few other countries like Iran, Russia, Cuba, like North Korea, DPRK, and Venezuela. And it is a way for the US to sanction any foreign company or country or individual that challenges the monopoly of these Silicon Valley tech companies. And you also see this as well in the EU. Like I won't go into it too much, but the EU, like in 2020, wait, no, not in 2020. I think they introduced it in 2020, but it hasn't come into play yet, but it might by the end of this year. These retroactive tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles, and their alternative would be US vehicles. Yeah, all this is to say that, a TikTok ban wouldn't just stem the flow of free speech, but it would also help concentrate US power in a way that just isn't sustainable and actively harms people in the global south, preventing poorer countries from developing. And yeah, I'm with Megan on this one. A lot of what I said has been very might sound a little bit scary and intense, but I do believe that there is a way forward, and I'm optimistic about it. And I believe the way forward is, collaboration and a turning away from war and towards peace, because the alternative, which is what's happening now, is just it's not sustainable for us, the planet, like really anyone. So yeah, this is why we need peace.
Thank you so
That's
much.
me done.
Thank you so much, Ting, and to all our speakers. Okay, so we will end at 9, so we only have a few minutes for questions and answers. So we're looking at the chat room. Do any of our speakers have questions that they want to particularly answer, or if not, then I can pick one from the chat room.
I can just illustrate one of the points with a graphic that might be useful, and that is this one, which is something that both Ting and Megan referred to, and this is a Rolling Stone story. You can see it's quite recent, and you can see this guy here, Romney, and you can see the importance of the case, which was about support for the genocide, or against the genocide, I should say, and support for Palestinians. Rolling Stone, online, a magazine directed to young people, and clearly this was a major problem because there was no control of the messaging, or because there was messaging that certain people in the United States, mostly Congress people, did not like, which and certainly AIPAC and the lobby did not like, and so this becomes part of this complexity of a very, very active media landscape that involves the kind of principles that Karen was talking about, and then is deeply personalized around political campaigns and political interests that then think that there's nothing wrong with banning people because they don't like their opinions and they don't like what they're taking on as matters of justice and of concern for the Palestinian people. So that's just one example that I have a graphic of that others might like to share, like to comment on.
Marcus, if I can just dovetail this, recently I saw a YouTube program featuring John Mearsheimer, the professor academician, who actually talked about the Israel lobby. And he mentioned that one thing about TikTok is that it is sharing a lot more of the atrocities that are happening in Gaza. So I was a little bit curious and I wonder whether whether TikTok shares more about what's happening in Gaza than the other social media platform. But again, according to John Mearsheimer, a professor, that he says that that's one reason why the Israel lobby is very upset with TikTok because it is sharing a lot of these videos. So that was interesting. Any of our other panelists would like to chime in on this or another question? I have a question here from the chat room that says, don't they know that starting a war with China could start World War III, which could lead to a possible nuclear holocaust? And if they do, what will they gain from a post-nuclear holocaust? That's an interesting, I mean, it's not a funny question. It's serious in terms of, what's going on around the world. But I don't know if there's any easy answer to that question.
There's no easy answer. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to this, but there have been very clear statements from some people in the US military that that there is an inevitability about war with China, and that is deeply disturbing and deeply distressing. And many of the arguments pro and for war with China, pro and against war with China, have been played out on social media platforms, including TikTok. And it's been very instructive to be able to watch people from within China, but also elsewhere, comment on this absurd idea of having a war against China. As if it's not bad enough at the moment for those of us in MAPA in the peace movement, but also those of us who want to live in a peaceful world and without strong arm tactics by the United States, always apparently leading to violence and warfare. I mean, we have a terrible record, as Megan said.
Yeah, and I don't have a great answer to the question because it's something I also frequently wonder about. But just the possibility is horrifying, and it's true that our military is they plan to be ready for war with China by 2027. It's, the Davidson window. And you wonder if it's sort of a willful ignorance or what's going on. And a lot of quotes from some of the military leaders are really scary. They really believe that if we go to war against China, like, we'll win and that it will have, I don't know, some sort of positive outcome, which is not true. Like, there's been reports, even a very, very mild conflict would have severe economic consequences for the entire world. And that's not, even including the physical reality of warfare and the possibility of escalation, which, multiple war games have said could very easily escalate into nuclear warfare. So it's very bleak and scary. And we need to be, talking about it more, I think.
There's one point I'd also like to make, which I think informs this even further, is that, again, social media, particularly TikTok, provides a very useful forum for a range of ideological points of view, not least of which are support for socialism, communism, and anarchism, all sorts of perspectives, many of which some of us may not appreciate or want to support. But there is a very volatile and active culture of debate about political perspectives. And I think probably our event tonight reflects some of this. And so there's a sort of a movement, as it were, from below I think it could be called a social movement, to suggest that there are other options, and that in some ways the US talk of war and the US being anti-China and against TikTok is a distraction against, you know, the real problems that the United States has, and the fact that there are other options being offered and put forward. And I'll just, again, given I'm in a graphics kind of mood, I'll show you this one here. Sorry, I'll show you this one here. Did I share screen? This one here. You know, this is the sort of classic distractive kind of thing, and this is the kind of material that's appearing in well, as you can see, Global Times in China, but also informing debates and discussions about the limitations of what the United States has on offer, the challenges that it's facing, the limits to its politics, the limits to the structure of its social and cultural world, and the options that are available. So this becomes part of a larger debate, which I think is useful to think about in terms of why certain platforms, such as TikTok, present a real challenge to the United States government. And you know, the solution, unfortunately, as both Megan and I think we all agree, is not warfare. It is some sort of collaboration and cooperation, not shutting down communication, but having more communication.
Okay, we are out of time, and I want to thank all four of our knowledgeable speakers for the invaluable insights and information. For more information and follow-up actions, please see the chat room for links. However, if you don't have time for that, we will follow up with an email to our audience with more information from tonight's program. So once again, thank you very much for participating, both our panelists and our audience. Good night.